Well, it is worth it to be together with you to express solidarity with Julian Assange and Chris Williamson. I want to say a few words about my encounters with WikiLeaks and the American authorities in their endeavor to frame Julian Assange. But we are discussing this under the heading imperialism on trial. Now, imperialism has been defined here before, and I agree with those definitions. Imperialism, in our mind, has not so much to do with emperors or kings, but it has to do with states or powers that want to gain control of land, people, and wealth. It has to do with interests. It has to do with corporate interests. It has to do with interests to possess and control everything. The air we breathe and the rain we enjoy. Why do I mention the rain? Do you remember Cochabamba in Bolivia? Bechtel arrived there in the late 1990s. Bechtel, the corporation that helped Saddam Hussein build up, construct in his heyday, and it also helped Bush to tear down. And then it came again to reconstruct. And when it left, it was given millions of dollars as a farewell gift from the US government, a gift from the empire to its master. That is what imperialism is about. Now, in the latter half of the 20th century and until our day, there have been attempts to globalize the world, globalize the economy of the world. And the attempts made in the latter half of the 20th century are very modest compared to what was later to come from the mid-1990s and then accelerating in the years of this century. In the wake of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, and there was an institution they wanted as well, International Trade Organization, ITO. It never came into being until with the advent of WTO, World Trade Organization, in the mid-1990s. But up till that time, the emphasis was on lowering tariffs, enabling trade throughout the world by lowering tariffs. GATT was the name, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. This was replaced by GATS with the advent of the World Trade Organization, established in 1994, began its work in 1995. From that time on, the task was to go inside the societies, not only enable trade between them, but go inside. And in fact, I wonder if one should use these words, trade agreements, trade negotiations, because it's an assault on society by the corporations. That is a more proper way of saying it. Now, GATS stands for General Agreement on Trade in Services. Similar attempts were being made by other institutions. The OECD started the May negotiations, multilateral agreement on investment in 1995, and it came to an end in 1998, and I will come to that later. But GATS, the World Trade Organization, really came to work in 1997, 98. And people quickly sensed what was happening, or they had a suspicion what might be happening. And they started to rise up. You remember Seattle in 1999, when the World Trade Organization had its meeting there. Where was the next meeting? It was in Qatar, Doha. Why there? Well, there is a lot of sand there, but few people. And they made arrangements that even organizations like the trade unions, PSI, Public Services International, with more than 20 million members, they could send only one representative. Each organization could send one representative. Now they were starting to close down. Now they were they were aware how important it was to have these conferences in secret and away from protesters. And this is exactly the same that happened with the May agreement I referred to, which was under the auspices of the OECD, as I said. It came to a stop when people got to know about it. That is when it was stopped. Now, after the Doha meeting in 2002, life was getting more difficult. Or was it 2001? Because in 2002, The Guardian, which may have been a bit more courageous in those years, exposed what was being discussed at the GATS meetings, and that the European Union, they were tabling demands against the poorer part of the world to open up for privatization, for example, of water. So now GATS was running into trouble. And finally in 2008, it was more or less off the table. The final note in 2011. But something was happening. And I was very keen to know this, and since in my former life I was the leader of the civil service unions in Iceland, I had good contacts with the trade unions in the Nordic countries. So I went to Sweden. Iceland is not part of the European Union, as you may know. We are part of the European Economic Zone. So I went to my colleagues in Sweden to ask for information, inside information. Could they provide me with that? Yes, we will do that. Can you give me some papers, some documents? Yes, we can give you some documents. For instance, this one here, from the Economic Policy Committee Working Group of the European Commission. Economic Policy Working Group. What does it say, I said? Well, it says this, and then it says this, and when we came to page 6, it says conclusions, and here results of this exercise can be summarized as follows. And here we have the rest. So this is for transparency. Now, is this a joke? Well, isn't there something called black humor? This is very black. Now, another little example from my own experience. Since I have this own experience, it's okay. Now, there is this parliamentary framework that World Trade Organization has. And they have an annual session of the Parliamentary Conference on the World Trade Organization, and this is organized with the Interparliamentary Union and the European Parliament. Now, I was lucky enough to be a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe at this time, and I was appointed by the Social Committee of the Parliamentary Council to represent the Council at this meeting. And what is more, we had a seat in the steering committee, in the innermost circle, the most holy of all. And I came there and I spoke. They didn't like that. So they wrote a letter on behalf of the European Union to the Council of Europe and said, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has been actively involved in the conference since its start and has a seat on the steering committee. We welcome this participation and active engagement, which has been a useful contribution to our work. We were, however, a little surprised that during the last meeting of the steering committee in Geneva on 13 June 2016, the representative, Mr. Jónasson, repeatedly took the floor, stating that he was expressing his personal opinion, where he did not hesitate to criticize different elements of EU trade policy. And to conclude with, the European Parliament delegation has shared this assessment with the IPU, co-chair of the conference, who was sympathetic to this argument. Democratic discussion. You know? Now the Council of Europe, not to make this longer, responded by sending me again, which was rather good. Now, so, the lesson of what I'm saying with may, with guts, is that when people are woken up and given information, we have a hurdle in this globalizing talk on the premises of big business, of the big corporates. And another thing that was happening in those years, probably partly stimulated by the May talks, multilateral agreement on investment in France, that was the center of these discussions, was the establishment of ATTAC, Association of the, for the Taxation of Financial Transactions for the Aid of Citizens. This is based on the ideas put forward by James Tobin in the 1970s to tax transactions and channel the money into socially constructive ways. Now, what happened after this is that we have some people who call themselves the really good friends of transnational corporations agreement. They were not too happy with the way GATT had stranded, so they decided to start anew. Now we will leave the poor part of the world behind. And we will start anew. The European Union, all the states spoke with one voice, no democratic discussion about this, one voice, and then 22 other states, the richest part of the world. And we had TISA in the making. Trade in Services Agreement. And this is happening at the same time that we get the transatlantic trade negotiations going, TTIPs, and the Trans-Pacific negotiations. Now, these negotiations start in 2000 well, the first feelers are put out in 2011. Then in 2012, 13, they really start with no democratic connections. And nobody knew about it until 2014. We are told about these negotiations and their content. And who did that? WikiLeaks. It was due to WikiLeaks that the world got to know about this. So it's not only military matters, it is matters that have to do with the way we organize our lives, the way we organize our societies. And just before I come to the closing points, I want to mention that there is a dimension here which has to do with the environment, of course. Because in the TTIPs negotiations, that's the transatlantic negotiations between the European Union and the United States, there are clauses which weaken the environmental dimension by deregulation. And this is admitted by the European Commission, that this is part of this agreement. But nevertheless, they are willing to do it. And they are also willing to do what has been most debated, to weaken the judicial structures of democratic states by creating tribunals where the corporations have a say and take disputes out of the hands of the individual states, and the judiciary is there. This is being debated, as we have heard about. And before I leave the environmental bit, I am sometimes surprised how little environmental discussion or discussion on the environment is linked with militarism. Do you know this summer, NATO, and primarily the Americans, they had an exercise in Iceland, military exercise. There were 10 ships, 600 Marines, 400 soldiers on land. And just after that, they moved to Norway, where there were 70 ships, 50,000 soldiers, 8,000 vehicles, tanks and other military vehicles. Is somebody talking about the environment? Do you know why they are having these exercises? It's because of the Russian threat in the North Atlantic. The Russian threat. I looked it up. I looked up military expenses of the big military states. The United States of America is spending more on the military than 7 states which come next to it: China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, Britain, Germany, France. On aggregate, the United States is spending more. They have 800 bases throughout the world, outside their territories, and they are becoming more numerous. Russia has 8 outside their borders. I'm not here to defend Russia specifically, but I'm wanting to put forward the truth. This is the truth of the matter. So, WikiLeaks was established in Iceland in 2006 by Julian Assange. The Americans have therefore been interested, or had their eye on us, Iceland, and possible links there. It was therefore, I presume, that in August 2011, they sent a plane load of prosecutors and FBI agents to Reykjavik Airport to meet with the Icelandic administration. But they were unlucky. I was the Minister of Justice. So I said, I remember in the ministry, when I was told about this, I had no clue that they were coming, that if I had to decide on whose side I was, if I had to side on either side, I would of course side with WikiLeaks, not the US administration hunting WikiLeaks. But it was not on those grounds that they were asked to leave the country, and all authorities in Iceland were asked not to cooperate with them at all. This was because they had not formally got a permission to come and carry out police work in Iceland. This was needed, but they had come earlier in the summer to ask us if we wanted cooperation on an imminent attack on our computer system they had knowledge about. And I said, of course, we want to hear what you have to say. And police agents, Icelandic police agents, went to Washington and they came to Iceland. But later it dawned upon me, of course, that this was a pretext for pretending that we were cooperating, and that this was just a continuation. But I know, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, I know for certain that they were in Iceland not to investigate anything, but to frame Julian Assange and have our assistance in doing so. And to conclude with, the last thing I would do to somebody who had been providing the world with the information WikiLeaks has been doing is to break their whistle. I will do everything I can to defend the whistleblower. Thank you.